She made the wrong call. That's the part nobody talks about when they see how it ended up. Brianna Rowe moved into the worst structure in the entire camp. Not the smallest, not the least private. The worst. And I mean that in the most literal sense. There was a hole in the east wall you could fit your forearm through. The roof had more brown than metal at that point. And the floor, if you could call it that, was a plywood sheet someone had partially pried up before giving up and leaving it half open like a wound. When the other people in the camp saw her dragging her bag toward it, a few of them laughed. Not mean laughing, more the kind of laugh that comes out of you when you watch someone make a decision you know is going to hurt them. One woman told her straight, "That thing is going to collapse before winter." Brianna heard it, kept walking. What she saw in that shack, nobody else could see yet. This is the story of what she did with it. Brianna was 24 when she ended up in Portland. She'd grown up in Medford, Oregon, which is about 4 hours south. And if you've never been there, it's a small enough city that when things go wrong for you, everybody you went to high school with notices. She'd had a job at a logistics company doing inventory processing. Nothing glamorous, but steady. She had a studio apartment on the east side, where she had a cat named Mallow, the kind of life that isn't remarkable and isn't supposed to be. That just holds together fine most of the time if nothing goes sideways. Two things went sideways at the same time, which is how it usually works. The company downsized and her position was cut. The same week, the building she rented in got sold, and the new owner came in with rent increases that didn't make any sense on what she was making even when she was employed. She had enough saved to cover about 6 weeks. She started applying immediately. She wasn't careless with it. She tracked every application in a spreadsheet and followed up and did everything the right way. The job market in Medford was not cooperating. By week 8, she was behind on rent. By week 10, she had a notice she didn't want to stay in Medford and have the people she'd grown up around watch her couch surf, so she made the call that felt humiliating but practical. She loaded what she could into a duffel bag and a couple of reusable grocery bags, surrendered the apartment, and got on a bus to Portland. Mallow went to her cousin's house. She didn't take the cat. That detail she doesn't bring up unless you ask. And when you do, she just says it was the right call and doesn't say anything else. Portland had resources she knew about. There were encampments that had some level of stability, some community structure, before she went. She found a spot near an area on the east side of the city where a cluster of people had been staying for a while without constant sweeps. There was an informal system, not formal, not organized, just people who'd been there long enough to know how it worked, and who helped new people understand what the unspoken agreements were. Don't mess with other people's setups. Keep your area clean enough that the city doesn't have a reason to come in. Don't bring problems to the camp from outside. She set up a tent. Standard, what she had. It was fine through the first 2 weeks, and then it rained the way it rains in Portland in November, which is to say it didn't stop, and the tent was rated for 3-season use, not whatever that particular November was. The floor flooded, not dramatically, just a slow wet creep that soaked the bottom of her sleeping bag and her extra clothes and the corner of the duffel bag where she kept documents. She dried everything out the best she could, but the sleeping bag never fully recovered, and for 3 nights she slept cold. That's when she noticed the shack. It was at the back edge of the camp against a chain-link fence that separated the encampment from an abandoned commercial lot. Nobody was in it. Nobody wanted it. If you looked at it straight on, the reason was obvious. The walls were corrugated metal sheeting, the original color completely lost under rust so dense it had texture. The roof had a dip in the center where the frame had buckled. One wall had been partially reinforced at some point with a piece of lumber that someone had nailed in crooked and then left. There was no door, just a gap where one had been, and a piece of tarp zip-tied to one side that could be pulled across it. Brianna walked around it twice. She put her hand against the wall in one spot to test the give. She looked at the roof from outside and tried to figure out where the buckle started and what was holding the rest of it. Or she asked the woman who had been in the camp the longest, a woman named Terry, who had a precise and unsentimental understanding of every structure in the area, whether anyone had claimed it. Terry said, "Nobody wants that thing." Brianna said, "I might." Terry said, "That's your business." And then the part that Brianna still remembers word for word, Terry looked at her and said, "Just so you know, the roof's going to go. That's not a maybe, that's a win." Brianna said she understood. She moved in the next morning. Here's what she'd seen that other people hadn't. The rust on the walls was surface rust, not structural failure, cosmetic. She knew the difference because her father had done metalwork as a side job, and she'd grown up in a garage where there was always a project in some state of repair on the workbench. She knew what metal looked like when it was eaten through versus when it was just oxidized on the outside. The walls were oxidized, not compromised. They'd held. The roof buckle was real, and Terry was right about it, but the buckle was in the center, and the four corners of the roof were still properly attached. The structure itself was a lot more sound than it looked. The floor problem she'd have to solve. She spent the first day just moving in and setting up her sleeping area in the driest corner, which was the northwest one. She inventoried what she had: her A-tarp, some rope, two bungee cords, a multi-tool that had been her father's and that she'd held onto through everything, a thermal sleeping bag rated to 20 degrees that was starting to show wear on one seam but was otherwise intact, three changes of clothes, a portable charger, her documents in a gallon Ziploc bag inside another gallon Ziploc bag, a small first aid kit, a wool blanket she'd bought at a thrift store for $4 before she left Medford, slightly itchy, completely reliable. The first thing she addressed was the roof. She didn't fix the buckle. She couldn't fix the buckle. She didn't have the tools or materials for that. What she did was put a tarp over the roof so that when water pooled in the buckle, it pooled on the tarp instead of finding its way through to the inside. Or she used the rope to secure the tarp over the top, ran it through the links of the chain link fence on one side, and tied off to the front corner of the structure on the other. It took her about 2 hours to get the tension right, so the tarp shed water off the back instead of just collecting it. When it rained that night, she lay in her sleeping bag and listened to the water run off the back. Nothing came through. That was the first night she slept the full way through since Portland. The wall with the hole she patched with a folded piece of cardboard and duct tape she'd gotten from a community supply distribution 2 days earlier. It wasn't a permanent fix. She knew it wasn't a permanent fix. But cardboard has real insulation value, and the tape held, and it cut the draft significantly. The tarp at the door, she adjusted so it overlapped the frame on the inside rather than outside, which kept it from being pushed in by wind. Small things, practical things. Each one fixed something specific. The floor problem took longer. The half-pried plywood was the issue. It wasn't just uncomfortable. It was a moisture trap. The cold came up through the gap, and in wet weather the gap let in ground damp that would work its way into anything stored at floor level. She couldn't nail the plywood back down because she didn't have a hammer. She spent 2 days looking for something that would work, and what she found was a length of broken concrete paving stone, flat on one side, that someone had dumped near the fence. She used it as a weight, placing it on the raised edge of the plywood to press it back flush. It worked well enough to close the gap. She put her tarp underneath her sleeping bag after that as a moisture barrier between the plywood and herself. None of this was impressive in isolation. That's the thing. Each individual fix was something anybody could do with the same materials. What made it work was the order. She addressed water first because water was the threat that would make everything else irrelevant. Then air, then ground cold. She thought about it in terms of what would kill her comfort first, second, third, and she worked in that order. People in the camp noticed she was doing something over there. A few came to look. Some of them offered opinions. One man named Patrick, who'd been in the camp almost 2 years and had his own very well-organized tent setup, came over and watched her work on the tarp roof for a while without saying anything. When she finished, he said, "I didn't think you could make that work." She said, "I'm not sure I have yet." He laughed. It was the first real conversation she'd had with someone in the camp. Patrick knew things about that area that took time to learn. He knew when the community organizations came around with supplies and what they had. He knew which city workers were hostile and which ones would give you a heads up if something was being planned. Or he knew where there was a working electrical outlet behind a building 3 blocks away that people used for phone charging if they were discreet about it. He started sharing that kind of information with her, not because she asked, not because he made a decision to. It just came out in conversation over the following days. That's how it works in camps when things are going reasonably okay. Information moves when people trust each other. She was 6 weeks into the shack when she found the insulation. There was a building going up about 8 blocks away, construction dumpsters. She walked by them regularly because that route took her past a library branch where she used the Wi-Fi in the bathroom and printed documents when she needed to. One afternoon, a roll of pink fiberglass battle insulation was sitting on top of a dumpster, full roll, still in plastic, dropped in there by someone who'd miscalculated, probably from a wall section that got replanned. She stood there for a moment looking at it. It was too big to carry easily. She went back to camp and found Patrick and asked if he'd help her carry something. He said, "What is it?" She said, "I'll show you." He came. They carried the insulation roll back between them. It was awkward, and it attracted looks from people they passed on the street, and she kept her eyes forward. When they got back, she cut it into sections with the multi-tool and pushed it into the wall gaps, behind the corrugated sheets where there was space, along the base of the walls where the cold came in most at night. The inside of the shack changed that night, not dramatically. She's careful about saying that. She didn't suddenly have a warm room. What she had was a room that held the heat from her body instead of draining it. That's different from warmth. It's the difference between a container and a sieve. She started making the inside livable in a different way after that. There were things she wanted that were practical, and things she wanted that were just for her, and she didn't pretend there was no difference. The practical things: a place to store her bag off the floor, a way to keep her documents and phone and charger in, one accessible spot, some system for wet clothes so they could dry without touching the floor. She solved these with what came available. Her milk crates she found near a grocery store, a short piece of wooden shelving someone had left on a curb, 2 blocks from camp, zip ties, and rope for anything that needed securing. She built a small raised platform for her bag using 2 milk crates and the shelf piece across them. It kept everything 6 inches off the floor, which was enough to matter. The things that were just for her. She found a small broken mirror at a thrift store that sold things for almost nothing, a circular one with a crack across one corner that they'd discounted to 50 cents, and she put it on the wall using a bent wire hook. She picked up a single succulent plant from a giveaway table outside a garden supply store, a small one in a plastic pot, and put it on the shelf. These things didn't make the shelter function better. They made her feel like someone lived there. That's a thing that's hard to explain if you haven't been in a situation like that. And Brianna doesn't try to over-explain it. She just says, it mattered. It mattered to wake up and see the plant and the mirror and the things she'd chosen to put there. It was the difference between a place she was surviving in and a place she was living in. Winter hit. Portland winters are not extreme by the standards of the Northeast or the Midwest, but they're consistent. Rain, cold, gray, with temperatures in the upper 30s and low 40s most nights, dipping below freezing occasionally. She'd been in the shack about 3 months when the hardest stretch hit, or a week of rain with no real break. Temperatures at night between 32 and 35. The tarp held, the insulation held. The cardboard patch on the wall got damp, and she had to replace it twice that week, which she did without complaint, because she had more cardboard, and it took 10 minutes. Patrick checked on her twice during that week, which she remembers specifically. The shack stayed dry inside, not comfortable in the way a house is comfortable. She's clear about that too. She wore her coat to sleep. She kept the wool blanket over the sleeping bag. Her hands were cold when she woke up, but she was dry and the space held about 15 degrees warmer than outside at night because of the insulation and the sealed gaps. That gap, 15 degrees, is significant when outside is 32. 47 is not warm. 47 is survivable in a way that 32 is not. Other people in the camp had harder nights that week. A woman named Dara, who had a tent that wasn't well sealed, came to ask Brianna if she could sit in the shack for a while to get warm. Brianna said yes. She let Dara charge her phone too because she'd made it to the outlet building that morning. These were small things. They're the kind of thing that starts to add up into something else. That week is when the camp's perception of her changed. It didn't happen as a moment. Nothing was announced. It was just that people who'd laughed at her choice in October were not laughing anymore, and people who'd ignored her the way you ignore someone who you assume has made a bad decision were paying attention. Patrick told her later that a couple of people had asked him about her, how she'd done what she did. He said he'd told them to ask her directly. A few did. She told them what she'd done in plain terms, the order she'd done it in, what material she'd found where, what had worked and what hadn't, the cardboard wall patch that kept failing, and what she'd eventually done to make it last longer. After she'd found a piece of rigid plastic from a broken storage bin and used that as the base, with the cardboard behind it as insulation and the tape over the whole thing. That held through the winter. She stayed in the shack 8 months total. She got a job in March through a workforce program that ran out of a nonprofit that had a presence at the camp, through data entry work remote, which meant she needed reliable internet, which meant she spent a lot of hours at the library, which she was already doing, so the transition was not as complicated as it might sound. She worked for 6 weeks, saved, and got into a transitional housing program that had a room available. She packed her bag. She left the plant, the succulent, on the shelf for whoever came next. She left the insulation in the walls. She left the tarp still tied over the roof. When she walked out of that camp, she walked out dry. Is this the version of the story where everything is fine now? That's the real question to sit with. The honest answer is, partly. She has a room. She has work. She has stability in the immediate sense of that word. She also has a credit record that took damage during those months, which affects what she can rent independently. She has a gap in her employment history that she has to explain in job applications and that some employers respond to badly and some don't. She carries that weight. It doesn't go away because the immediate crisis is over. What she says about the shack, if you ask her directly, is that it gave her the one thing that everything else required: time. A dry place to sleep meant she wasn't fighting her body every morning just to think clearly. Thinking clearly meant she could do the work of getting out. The shack wasn't the solution. It was what held the solution together while she built it. Terry told her the roof was going to go. She was right. It went the following autumn, after Brianna had already left. By then, someone else was in the space. They'd already patched it with materials they found, because by that point the camp knew what was possible in that structure, and Brianna had shown them the logic of it. Here she found out about the roof collapsing from Patrick, who stayed in contact. She said, "I'm glad I got the good months out of it." That's how she talks about most of it. Flat, specific, no inflation. The shack is probably still there. The chain link fence is definitely still there. If you walk that part of that area on the east side of Portland, you'll see the kind of structure she's describing: rusted, squat, easily mistaken for junk, the kind of thing people walk past and don't look at twice. Brianna looked at it twice. She walked around it. She put her hand on the wall and felt whether the metal gave. Most people couldn't tell you what they'd find inside a structure like that if they walked in. Brianna could. She built what was in there: a raised platform, a shelf with a plant on it and a cracked mirror and her phone on its charger, a floor that was sealed, walls that held heat, a tarp that moved water off the roof and into the gravel behind the fence. The knowledge that made all of that possible didn't come from anywhere that sells it: her father's garage. Paying attention to what she had, working the problem in the right order. These are things that can't be charged for and don't require anything beyond what most people already have, somewhere in their experience, if they stop and look for it. She says if she had to do it again, and she says this without any drama around it, she'd go straight to the worst-looking structure in the lot. She'd look past the rust. She'd find the one with the best bones. That's the thing about looking at something most people have already written off. They've done the work of deciding it's worthless for you, which means they've also cleared the path. The source on this story is Brianna herself, in conversations over several months. The shack was her account. The materials were hers. The order she worked in was hers. Nothing in this story comes from a manual.